Okay.
So Youri is recording the call. Yep.
Okay, perfect. All righty. Well, everyone, welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. Very honored for the guests that we have here. Always honored for the guests I have, but very, very excited for the guests that we have. It is we are joined by Peter Kuznick, who is a historian and director of American University's Nuclear Studies Institute. Did I get that right, Peter?
Yeah, you did. Yep.
Perfect. And many of you will know him as the co-author with Oliver Stone's The Untold History of the United States, which was adapted into a brilliant series, history series at Showtime. And well, we're going to get right to it. First of all, Mr. Kuznick, thank you for joining us on One Plus One.
Happy to be with you, Youri.
Perfect. And all right, so let's get to it. So first, the very first question, so the very first question I want to ask you is your thoughts on the 4th of July, because this is the 4th of July, and do you think with all of the direct action of taking down monuments of Confederate secessionists, that why not be more radical, and why not take down flags and monuments to the founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln, Mount Rushmore, J. Edgar Hoover, and dare I say, why not even change the the American flag to something much more inclusive to indigenous. And yeah, your thoughts on that?
I like where the movement is going now. I like that it's being targeted. And by doing so, it's being much more effective. Donald Trump is accusing the movement of doing or wanting to do what you're suggesting. And that's the way he plays to his base, by saying they want to wipe out all of our history, all of our proud traditions. The United States is a funny country in that sense, because if you look at it historically, on the one hand, it really did stand for something in the eyes of the world. Mm-hmm. The American Constitution, but much more the Declaration of Independence. I do argue that the Constitution was in many respects a counter-revolution, that the period from Jefferson declaring all men are created equal, to the point where in the Constitution we enshrine slavery. So it's only 13 years later, and now we're enshrining slavery. Now we're disenfranchising African Americans, women, basically working people. So there was something happened during those 13 years. But the original idea that was embodied in the rebellion against British colonialism was, not to say that, but because we're dealing with 18th century flawed human beings with a much more limited understanding of human rights. But there were people at the time who had a much more expansive understanding, and Tom Paine was certainly one of them. And his pamphlet, Common Sense, which really sparked the revolution, was because the fighting had begun in 1775. It wasn't until a year later, in July of 1776, that we declare independence, separate from England, that we sign the Declaration of Independence, that we affirm these values that we hold. So the United States has been schizophrenic. There are some people who want to simply condemn the American experiment from the beginning because it was tarnished by racism, by slavery, by taking the land from the Native Americans, which eventually led to the genocide of Native Americans. That is part of the story. But there's another part in which people did strive for higher ideals. And to those around the world, the United States represented something positive, despite all the baggage that the United States had. And Americans themselves often believed that and wanted their country to live up to those standards. And there have been examples of great American leaders throughout history who were flawed. Thomas Jefferson is a perfect example of that. Oliver Stone and I sometimes had bitter fights about Hamilton and Jefferson. Uh, but I think people have a somewhat too simplistic view of the two of them, whereas you can say that in some ways Jefferson had wonderful ideals, and when he came to it in practice, he still embraced slavery and was able to find the time to write and do the other things he did because of the labor of so many enslaved people. And that's true. So Jefferson was a limited and flawed human being. Hamilton had his own limitations. Um, and we can say that he's responsible for the rise of capitalism. Capitalism in the 18th century context was in certain ways a more progressive view than the old agrarian view that Jefferson and Madison embraced. But there were still those higher ideals, and some of Jefferson's writings were beautiful. So this was a very cultured man, a man of science. John Kennedy, my favorite president, certainly since World War II. John Kennedy once addressed a dinner of Nobel Prize winners, and he said, this is the most impressive gathering of intelligence and creativity that has ever been here at the White House, except for when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. So, and that, and Kennedy understood that, and that Thomas Jefferson embodied what the greatness of America at a certain point, but he was a limited and flawed human being who tolerated slavery and thought that blacks were not equal to whites during that time and wrote about that. So, but that's the nature of the American experiment, that in some ways it represented higher ideals that we should be proud of, but a lot of times the practice beneath that was sordid and contradictory to those ideals. And so the history of the American Empire. So do I think we should tear down the statues and the monuments to Jefferson and to Washington and Madison? No. I think we have to study that. We have to understand them, put them in context, and tear down the ones that, because when a statue and a monument means that we're honoring that person. And so those who were traitors to the country, those who fought against the United States in order to preserve slavery or commit genocide against Native Americans, those people are a different category of evil, represent something quite different. So I think that we have to make that distinction. And doesn't mean we have to be proud of everything in our past, but we have to reckon with that past because that's part of what made us who we are.
Well, I would say this is the last question I actually asked David Swanson, the very well-known anti-imperialist and anti-war activist and writer. And when I posed that question to him, he said, look, if people want to keep all of those statues, they can keep all those statues. But instead, why not actually have more monuments and museums to actually people who actually fought against, war, people who actually fought against, imperialism and racism and sexism and so forth. And why don't we actually build more more monuments and statues to them? And I think a good compromise, so to speak, on the whole thing is okay. If you don't want to tear down statues of the founding fathers and replace replace the currencies, then at least let's build a new museum. And instead of just tearing them down, you can even put some of those statues to both Confederates and to the founding fathers. Let's build like a new museum where you actually do discuss, where you demystify, the half truths, and you actually do, examine them, warts and all. And I think that's a pretty good compromise where the nationalists can still say, okay, they didn't tear it down, and I'm pretty sure, they'll have very spirited debates, hopefully not violent, with those who are much more radical and would like to just tear down all the statues and maybe even flirt with the idea of demolishing Mount Rushmore and so forth.
Well, David lives in the South. He lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. So we have kind of a little slack. I think we should take down the Confederate monuments and those who were people who represented something really evil in our history. But I think we should put them in museums, as you're suggesting, because
Yeah.
we can't forget that part of our past. We do need to study that. So they should be preserved. They should be studied. And other statues, as you're saying, should replace them. We have a lot of people we should be honoring. There is a Martin Luther King memorial in Washington, D.C. now. Yeah, so we are beginning to broaden our definition of heroes. There are a lot of people that don't want to celebrate Columbus Day.
Yeah, me included.
I give a lot of lectures on Christopher Columbus because I think that he got us off to a pretty awful start, starting slavery and the kinds of horrible things that he did. So with the quincentennial, that was much more being recognized than it had been earlier. One of my earliest television appearances was on Entertainment Tonight back in 1992, where they had me with some right-winger debating Columbus's legacy. That was a long time ago. So I think that, but we look at America's museums more broadly. I take my students every year to Japan for the commemorative events surrounding the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mm-hmm. This is the first time since 1995 that I'm not going to be in Japan for the anniversaries.
Because of COVID-19.
Yes, yeah, we had to cancel. And Japan has a phenomenon that's alien to America. It's called peace museums. They got peace museums all over. Most American museums are war museums. We don't have, there's one small peace museum in Dayton, Ohio. And sometimes there was one in Chicago, but we don't have peace museums. Now, I was very much involved in 2003, I think it was, when they put up the Enola Gay, and they displayed the Enola Gay at the Uvar-Hazy annex to the Air and Space Museum. I led the protest against that. I'd been somewhat
because you felt, rightly so, it was glorifying the atomic bomb and engaging in a lot of mythology, right?
Well, we had a debate in the anti-war community, and one of the women argued that they should not be displayed at all. The plane that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima, dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It should not be. She said it was like displaying a Nazi gas chamber, and we'd never allow that. I argued that we have to display it, that we have to remember it, that we have to study it, but it has to be put in historical context. And some of the history about who was involved and why and what was the thinking and justification has got to be included in the exhibit. When the Air and Space Museum finally unveiled it, it didn't include any information, just some basic information about the plane itself, really. So none of the historical context, none of the debate. And we went back and forth with the Smithsonian, and it was covered in the New York Times and other places. And we had Nobel Prize winners and Academy Award winners and others signing our statement. So we generated a lot of discussion. As to the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian in 1995, which got canceled, generated a lot of discussion. I'm still involved in that right now, along with 3 other authors who were in the forefront of writing about the bomb decision, Gar Alperovitz and Marty Sherwin and Kai Bird. Gar wrote the original great books, Atomic Diplomacy and the Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. Marty wrote some very good books, and Marty and Kai together won the Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Robert Oppenheimer, American Prometheus. So we've got a lot of credentials to wage this, and we're going to be doing 2 things. One is going to be a media briefing with journalists all over the world so that they hopefully won't be peddling the same kind of nonsense that they've been peddling for years. And
that's dropping the atomic bomb we had to deal with in order to end the war. Otherwise,
It would have been an American invasion and 500,000 boys would have been killed, Truman says. Marshall told him, which is not true ever. But one of the fundamental myths, yeah, as you might have seen in some of my interviews, I argue that there are three fundamental myths in World War II. The first is that the United States won the war in Europe, when, of course, we know that the Soviets won the war in Europe, that throughout most of the war, the US and the British were confronting 10 German divisions between us, while the Soviets were confronting more than 200 German divisions as a result. So therefore, 80% of Germany's losses were on the Eastern Front, not the Western Front. And Churchill says the Red Army tore the guts out of the German war machine. We know that. We know that the Americans suffered about 300,000 combat deaths, 400,000 in total, and the Soviets lost 27 million. So, when I try to tell my students what 27 million means, I tell them that's the equivalent of one 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. That's what the Soviets suffered in World War II. How many countries have we invaded and bombed in the aftermath of 9/11? Well, they had one a day, every day for 24 years. So, we don't have historical context in the United States. This is not something that American students know. They have no idea how many Americans died. They have no idea how many Soviets died.
Mm-hmm.
I once did an anonymous survey with college students, and I asked them how many Americans died in World War II. And the median answer I got was 90,000. So they were only 300,000 off. It's in the ballpark, relatively. I asked them how many Soviets died, and the median answer I got was 100,000. So they were only 27 million off. That means they know nothing about World War II, nothing about the Cold War, nothing about Ukraine now. They just don't. You have to know history, or else you're blind in this world, and you can't be an organizer. So the second event that Gar and Marty and Kai and I are doing is a big movement event, and that's going to be on July 25th, and that's open to everybody. And we're going to be educating not just the movement, but the public in general. We've got about 15 different groups that are co-sponsoring it, and we have just started to build that, so it's going to be a lot more. So, because we have to teach people the history. So the second myth about World War II is that the atomic bombs were not only justifiable, they were humane, because they saved American and as the story evolves, and they saved Japanese lives. And we can also say they saved Chinese lives by ending the war sooner. The reality is, go to the official U.S. Navy Museum here in Washington, D.C. They've got a display on the bomb, and they say very, very clearly that in the deliberations of the Japanese cabinet leading up to the surrender, the atomic bomb was hardly mentioned at all. The discussion all focused on the Soviet invasion that had started at midnight on August 8th, and which changed the equation, because the Japanese leaders had accepted that the United States could wipe out Japanese cities. We firebombed more than 100 Japanese cities.
Yeah.
Oliver Stone and I went a couple summers ago to Toyama, and because we wrote about Toyama, so the city invited us to come there and speak and kick off their new museum, because 99.5% of the city of Toyama was wiped out in the firebombing. 99.5%.
Mm-hmm.
And so to the Japanese leaders, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, horrible as they were two more cities. They could accept that. What changed the equation for them was the Soviet invasion, which they had been dreading, and which American intelligence knew was going to end the war. We look at the April 11th and the July 6th reports from the Joint Intelligence Committee to the Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting, combined Chiefs of Staff. They said very clearly that Soviet invasion will convince all Japanese once and for all that defeat is inevitable. They will end the war. And it did. And it ended the war very, very quickly. But that's the second myth. So not only were the bombs necessary, they were actually humane, which is so destructive. The reality is just the opposite. And what I write about in that regard is what I call the apocalyptic narrative, which makes it even worse. What I make clear is that Truman, little man as he was, and relatively ignorant man as he was, Truman understood that he was beginning, not just dropping a bigger, more powerful bomb, but beginning a process that could end life on the planet. And as he says, when he gets a full briefing on the bomb test at Alamogordo at Potsdam on July 25th, said, this may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. So about the fire destruction. He says that on several occasions. So we're not talking about wiping out one or two cities. We're talking about, as Oppenheimer briefed the interim committee that was making the decisions about what to do with the bomb, he says on, I think it was May 31st, he says that within 3 years, we're going to have weapons between 700 and 7,000 times as powerful as the one we're going to be dropping on Hiroshima. They knew what the future was. The leaders all knew it. Even Truman, who knew very little, knew that. So that was the second myth. The third is that the Cold War started during World War II and soon thereafter because of Soviet aggression.
Okay.
Now you might hear my tree frogs croaking. Okay, shut up. Let's stop with it. They tire themselves out. But that's those are the three major myths of World War II. So our history, it gets back to your first question. Our history is replete with examples of myth-making, falsification, whitewashing, sanitizing, misinformation, lies, sanitized lies. This is a big part of what American history is about and what the kids get taught in schools. The role of historians is to complicate the story and to try to interject some of the alternative understandings so that people can have a much more rounded picture. And that's what goes on at the universities. The way history is taught at most universities is a very progressive interpretation of history. The way history is taught in the public schools and the high schools is still a very conservative, one-sided attempt to adulate the United States in a way that we call American exceptionalism. The idea that the United States is great, better than all other countries, God's gift to humanity, freedom-loving, sacrificing so that people all over the world could have liberty and freedom. And whenever we go abroad, it's because we want to fight for people's rights overseas, not because we want territory or resources or cheap labor or investments. That's never what motivates the United States, except in reality all the time. But that's not the story we tell. When Obama addresses the troops coming back from the Iraq War at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, named after one of these traitors, Obama says, that's what makes us different. We don't go over there because we care about their oil. Of course, that's why we're in Iraq. What do you think?
Exactly.
He says we go over there because we believe in freedom. So pathetic. But that's what Americans are fed, this American exceptionalism. That's the air they breathe, the water they drink, turn on the television. They turn it on today, for example. The big story about the Russians paying a bounty for killing American troops in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I have yet to hear one American commentator on mainstream media talk about the U.S. luring the Soviets into invading Afghanistan in 1979. Brzezinski was riling up the insurgents there because he knew that it was
radical Sunnis who would later crash, the World Trade Center. Yeah.
I mean, we trained them, we armed them, we gave them the propaganda. They were using propaganda, the Taliban, the original insurgents there, the Mujahideen, who pulled together to fight and kill the Russian troops who were there. Now, and what did they dislike about the Russians, the pro-Russian government that was in Afghanistan? They disliked, number one, that they were educating women and girls. They disliked, number two, that they were trying to institute land reform and a more secular government. And so who did we support? The crazies, the Islamic extremists, the ones who later do, as you're saying, blow back on us on August 11th. This was a part we worked with the Pakistanis and the Saudis to help create this monster that still plagues the world. But you don't see that. There's nobody mentions that on American television. It does not get mentioned once. So while
and actually interesting, and now just thinking about it, and the Republicans, I do agree with people sometimes when they say that the Republicans are in many ways worse than the Democrats. If you want to talk about the fact that they're both rival oligarch parties, both warmongers and so forth. But funny enough, yeah, it was actually under Mr. Human Rights Champion Jimmy Carter and his version of his Democrat version of a Kissinger, Zabriskie, that actually the Afghanistan war, started, and of course, under Reagan made it even much more lethal.
As Brzezinski said, he didn't mourn the Soviet invasion. He said, now we've given them their own Vietnam. And Brezhnev, like the American idiots who get us in these wars, said the war will be over in 2 weeks. 10 years later, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, partly as a result of this absurd war that they fought there, it was still going on till finally Gorbachev ended it. But the point that I was making, of course, is that there is no context, no balance on American mainstream media. As much as I do interviews, right, and I do more than 200 a year all over the world, I almost never get asked to say anything in U.S. mainstream media. I'm all over mainstream media in.
And that's even with being associated with Oliver Stone, who is a twice Academy award-winning award-winning director.
Best director, best picture, screenwriting, yeah. But when Untold History came out, we did get put on mainstream media in the beginning. We were on the CNNs and the MSNBCs and other mainstream media. Partly because they wanted to attack us. It didn't work when we have an exchange, but the New York Times published the most scurrilous, and the New York Review of Books tried to kill Untold History when it came out. And they published absolutely scurrilous, reprehensible nonsense about it, even though 85% of the reviews we got were effusive. Even though we've got blurbs, the first blurb we got was from Mikhail Gorbachev. The second blurb was from Dan Ellsberg. The third was from Bill Maher. And then the historians started to weigh in and saying this was like the best thing that's been done in the 21st century. It's indispensable. I got great blurbs from all these top historians. But the ones, they would go and they would find this one right-winger who was attacking us and one centrist from Princeton who was attacking us. So I mean, but this is what we were, and that would get magnified everywhere, and all the praise we were getting from people all over the world would get subordinated. That was the way. So they tried to.
Interesting.
From the very, very beginning, but we did get on the shows. We were on most of those shows. But some people, like Charlie Rose, who always has Oliver on, refused to have us on. NPR was becoming more corporate during that time, and they would not touch anybody who dealt with issues of American empire. So we were on a lot of the local NPR stations, but we were not on
and
the big.
And was that the same with PBS? Because PBS tends to be more. I mean, I don't like the term progressive, but PBS does tend to be more. I think kind of like you and me. Like we try to be very much objective and look at both sides, and do look at warts and warts and all of American history, and of course other people's histories.
Mm-hmm. PBS would not touch us either, but PBS, I started to see the change with the first Gulf War, and it was at that point that I saw PBS go from being very progressive in its coverage to being flag waving and accepting the official line. And I've never seen it really divert from that in when it comes to foreign policy issues.
So does
Like
that mean then? So does that mean then that PBS sometimes, like with Frontline, they will publish, a Frontline series, like Robert Perry, who I definitely want to talk about when it comes to Ukraine. That sometimes they will publish Robert Perry and his October surprise series, but then other times, and especially with the news, they just have to sort of like drown it out with American jingoism and having on professional liars, and propagandists. So with every one documentary they'll show, which is critical of American history, that still is, as John Pilger always says, that's the exception to the rule, because then all the other times, you're watching PBS 24/7, it's propaganda, 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 and oh, look, it's time to go watch Call the Midwife.
well, in all honesty, I stopped watching PBS in 1991 during the first Gulf War. I couldn't stomach it, and I've never gone back. People send me Frontline links and say I should look at it. I haven't had the stomach to do so since that point. So I didn't even know that they had anything about Bob on PBS, Bob Perry. So that I didn't even know.
All right. Well, you already actually got into some of the questions I want to talk about, but before we get more into some of the Cold War myths and World War II myths, just then very briefly, because this is the 4th of July, your reflections on the ongoing apartheid that Indigenous Americans face, and the legacy of Russell Means and Dennis Banks, the founders of the American Indian movement, who both have sadly passed away, but their deaths and their legacies didn't get much coverage on even left-leaning news outlets.
So what was the first part of that question?
Your reflections on the ongoing injustice that Native Americans still face.
I think the movement now is very exciting. This is the most exciting period in American history since the late 1960s.
Okay.
There is more potential for change. Even this morning, the lead item in the news was the Washington Redskins are going to probably be forced to change their name and their logo. Finally, after decades of this racist bullshit from this little twerp Dan Snyder. I mean, I don't want to start on Dan Snyder. Got bigger fish to fry. But the racism is very deeply ingrained in American life. But what's interesting now is not just how much activism there is, how many hundreds of thousands of people have been out protesting. The interesting thing is the way this is being received by mainstream America. And all of the surveys show that despite the efforts by Trump and Fox News and others to focus on the vandalism and the looting and the violence, people are not buying it. Even Trump voters from last time are not buying it. There's watching that George Floyd video is so horrific. You can't, and then everything else that's come out about all these other murders is just beyond the point where any slightly decent human being can close his or her eyes to this reality. And the police violence is just one little piece of the oppression of minorities in this country. The average Black family in the United States has somewhere between 1/10 and 1/20 as much wealth as the average white family. And this is because of systematic discrimination, especially in terms of housing. We know that the wealth that most people have in this country is largely in their homes, and Blacks were never allowed to live in the neighborhoods that the values were going up. They were never able to get the loans. There were the various kinds of breaks that white middle-class homeowners and working-class homeowners were able to get. African Americans were denied. But there's that kind of systematic racism, even in the New Deal, the HOLC and all the red line that was going on. This could really, the New Deal does not have a very good record either when it comes to treating African Americans. Those who fought for better treatment of African Americans, Harold Ickes and Henry Wallace and Eleanor Roosevelt, were fighting a lonely struggle still in the 1930s and 1940s. And Franklin Roosevelt, wonderful as he was in many ways as an American president, was very political, very pragmatic. He knew he had to keep that Democratic coalition together, and that meant placating the Southern senators and congressmen who held those positions of great power in the Congress. And so he didn't even support the anti-lynching bill in the 1930s. So, but again, this sorry history that we have. When it comes to Native Americans, there is a general belated recognition that the government treated them terribly, stole their land. A little bit of understanding of even the occasions in which smallpox-infested blankets were given them. I mean, that's not the rule, that's the exception, but it happened, and breaking the treaties one after another and going to war and stealing their land and the fighting on the frontier.
And of course, the brutal residential school programs.
Yeah. So this is a part of the history that is not glorified anymore, but the people who fought against Native Americans are not systematically, their statues have not been systematically taken down to the extent they should. Native Americans protested yesterday when Trump spoke at Mount Rushmore, which is land that is supposed to be theirs. And it got some coverage, but there's still not a real reckoning of what happened to the Native Americans has not yet occurred.
And then very briefly on that, but you said that you're optimistic that with all of the people power protest movements and even some of the global solidarity movements, because I know in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, their biggest minorities, their biggest minorities actually are the Indigenous people, and there's a kind of a solidarity there. So in Canada, when you mention anti-Black racism, it's followed by first anti-Indigenous racism, but you're optimistic that what's happening now in the U.S. means that there's actually going to be finally some kind of a golden opportunity to address the systemic racism that that Indigenous Americans face.
Well, there's never any guarantee, but what we see now is an openness. We see now, and again, we have to thank Donald Trump for this in part. I mean, Trump is so backward, so bigoted, so racist, so small-minded, and so inflexible that he, instead of embracing the protest, the way even many of the Republicans have been forced to do, at least to pay lip service to, Trump's only play that he has is to double down against it. And every day he's, at least some of the Republicans can say, well, they clearly are motivated by social justice and by a defensible condemnation of bad things that have happened. Trump can't even go that far. Trump just denounces, and says that these radicals who are trying to destroy America and tear it down, who are out there protesting, and nobody buys it. But partly because of that, people are saying, "Well, God, what is wrong with us? What as a nation, and how did we elect? Even though, of course, he didn't win the popular vote. He lost by 3 million votes, and it's only because our system is so screwed up A state like Wyoming gets, has 2 senators, and so does the state with
As
40.
well as some of the voter suppression that
Yeah.
the Trump campaign did engage in, that Greg Palast exposed.
And they're trying to do it again. And their hench people in all the different states are trying to double down on voter exclusion again, voter suppression. And Trump has said, he said, if we allow mail-in ballots and everybody votes, then the Republicans are never going to win another election. He says that openly. And he's right. But what's going to happen now in this election? Biden is not a very compelling figure, and Biden is not an inspirational figure, and Biden is not a progressive figure, and Biden would be somebody who we would all be condemning if it were other circumstances. But Donald Trump is so dangerous that people are going to come out to vote in droves, and it's not going to be a pro-Biden vote. It's going to be an anti-Trump vote. Biden right now is in the witness protection program, or he had been for a long time. And he was down in his basement and hiding. And his approval rating was skyrocketing because everything Trump did was so radioactive, so toxic, so destructive. So Biden should, to the extent that he speaks out, he says, I'm going to be tougher on the Chinese than Trump is, and I'm going to be tougher on the Russians than Trump. I mean, just all the wrong
And the
things.
Venezuelans.
All the wrong things are coming out. But, the thing about Trump, so I have friends, David Swanson, for example, who thinks that we have to vote against Biden too, that Biden also represents American empire. But the big difference that I have, and David and I have debated this some, we don't have time to stop global warming. This is one of the two or three existential crises that we face right now. If we had another 4 years before we acted on that, we might be irreversible. It might already be too late. We might have already reached a tipping point when it comes to the climate. But we still have a chance. And Biden will be much, much better. He'll get us back to the lousy Paris Climate Accords. He's sensitive to this issue. He understands it, and he'll act on that, number one. Number two, the other existential threat we have that we'll probably talk about later is the nuclear threat. And Biden will definitely renew the New START Treaty, which is the last piece of arms control architecture we have in the United States. And that expires in February 2021. Trump has indicated that he doesn't want to renew it. He doesn't like it. He's told Putin. Putin has urged him repeatedly to renew the New START Treaty. And Trump says, oh, no. He says, maybe I'll consider it if the Chinese will join in. He says, we don't want that China's not party to it. Well, the reality is that China's got 1/20th the nuclear arsenal that the United States and Russia have. Between the United States and Russia, we have 93% of the world's nuclear weapons. So if he's allowed to dismantle that, then we go back to a 1980 style nuclear arms race, and it's going to be, we might not survive it anyway, but the odds of not surviving it as a species, as a planet, go up dramatically. So for those two reasons alone, the pandemics, those are three reasons why everybody has to come out and support Biden, not to do it blindly, not to say that Biden is the answer, because he's not the answer in any sense. But when you're dealing with existential crises, you have to act in that way. In the same way we should have been involved in World War II earlier. Hitler represented as close as we've had in that period to an existential crisis and to pure evil being unleashed. And so there's a lot of things we could talk about.
Yeah. And well, I would just say I don't agree that we should support Joe Biden, but I think the way you frame it is much better, of maybe trying to convert pissed off Sandinistas and Tulsitas to support Joe Biden, as opposed to Noam Chomsky, who tried to emotionally blackmail people with the World War II card, which if you watched my interviews with Margaret Kimberly, we both were like, nah, sorry, not going to work this time. But okay, let's get into the topics that that you already addressed, and hopefully the plight of Native Americans, Alaskans, and Hawaiians is finally at the forefront, just as Black Lives Matter. But okay, let's get into it. What are your let's get into these other questions. Okay, so what are your reflections on World War II, and do you agree with the columnist and author Peter Hitchens, who is no flaming left winger, but who wrote a book called "The Phony Victory: The World War II Illusion"? And one of the theses of that book is that World War II is cynically used to justify, more imperialism. And he goes after the myth that Churchill was this great, uh, you know, army genius, and you already addressed some of that. That actually it was the Soviet Union that actually paid more in blood, and with the army. So yeah, so what are your reflections on World War II and Peter Hitchens's thesis of his book, arguing that it's cynically used for more imperialism and so forth?
Well, I haven't read Peter's book, so I can't really comment on that. Uh, but World War II, in some ways, is a founding myth for the post-war world. Oliver and I went after this notion of the greatest generation.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Brokaw's writing about the World War II generation being the greatest generation. We certainly did, the United States did help the Soviets defeat the Nazis in World War II. The United States deserves a lot of credit for that. But if you look at that war, it is not a great war and was not fought the way it needed to be fought. The United States gets involved late. Roosevelt said, we'll declare a war, we won't fight it. We'll fight the war, we won't declare it, basically. The United States was involved earlier, and Roosevelt wanted to get the United States involved, but there was such strong anti-war opposition in the United States because we got suckered into World War I. And World War I, in many ways, was a war to redistribute the colonies. It was not a war to make the world safe for democracy or the war to end all wars. It was the war to make a new world order possible with new colonial powers. We get into that history too. But the Americans revolted against it. And by the mid-1920s, by 1925, the #1 box office movie was The Big Parade, strong anti-war movie, and anti-war books, anti-war novels. Americans by the 30s were strongly condemnatory of World War I and what it stood for and U.S. involvement and the way it was fought. And so Americans were loath to get involved in it, pulled into another European war.
Mm-hmm.
And that was unfortunate because we could have stopped the fascists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. The Soviets did help the Spanish Republic. The United States stayed neutral, which there were a lot of people certainly who were pushing for the U.S. involvement. And Roosevelt later said it was the dumbest thing to not be involved there. And then we got the Nazi-Soviet pact, and that complicates things. The Soviets are no longer playing a kind of leading anti-fascist role between 39 and 41 until they get invaded on June 22nd of 41, and then things change. But the United States gets involved December 7th when we get bombed at Pearl Harbor, and the United States gets involved, but we don't get really, well, it takes a year before we're ready to jump into the fighting. But
You mean talking about Normandy, talking about like a European invasion?
I'm talking later. That's going to be much later.
Okay.
But in May of 19, but we were supplying with Lend-Lease. We were giving the Soviets the materiel that they needed, the planes. We only delivered a small fraction of what we promised, and that was partly some sabotage, partly because it took the U.S. much longer than it should have to gear up to convert to the war production. So the United States was slow in getting involved and giving and sending the aid that we promised. So Roosevelt knew that one of the other demands, since he didn't want to concede to Soviet territorial demands, he didn't want a kind of a sphere of influences world that came out of World War I. So he resisted that, even though Churchill was willing to give them the territorial demands. What Roosevelt's strategy was to open up the second front. So in May of 42, he writes to Stalin and says, please send over Foreign Minister Molotov and a trusted general to come to Washington. Before that, Roosevelt had gotten Churchill's agreement to open up the second front. And that was what the Soviets really wanted, because they were doing all the fighting. They were doing most of the dying. They were the ones who were confronting the German war machine. And so they wanted a second front in Western Europe. And so at the meeting with Molotov, Roosevelt turns to General Marshall, and says, can we open up the second front, if necessary, before the end of this year? And Marshall says, absolutely. And we issued this proclamation then that we were going to open up the second front in Europe before the end of 1942. The Soviets were ecstatic. That's exactly what they wanted. American correspondents in Russia said if for any reason the U.S. fails to deliver on this promise, the entire Soviet Union is going to be crushed. And that was going to be the plan before the end of World War II. Instead, Churchill drags his feet. Churchill resists. He says, we don't have the transports. We're not ready to do that. And so Roosevelt, thinking the U.S. had to get involved somewhere, agrees to the campaign in Northern Africa. His military leaders were furious. Marshall condemns this periphery pecking, as he calls it, and says, he was so angry, he said, we should change our strategy and we should fight the Japanese first and let the Europeans stew in their own juices, basically, or let the British stew in their own juices. Eisenhower, who led the campaign in North Africa, said that when we invade North Africa, it's going to be the darkest day in human history. He was furious also. And so we go and we start a fight in the Mediterranean and come up in the soft underbelly. What we're really doing was defending and protecting British imperial interests in the Mediterranean. And so by the time we finally open up the second front on D-Day, Normandy, on June 6th of 1944, by that point, the tide of war had changed. The Soviets had defeated the Germans at Stalingrad. They'd won the huge tank battle at Kursk. They survived the siege of Leningrad, and they were now chasing the Germans across Russia and across Central Europe. And so by that point, when the U.S. gets involved, diplomatically, Roosevelt didn't have any cards to play because the Soviets were in the commanding position that Stalin never thought they would be in. And they had occupied Eastern Europe and Central Europe and had gone to Berlin. And the Americans and the Brits are coming the other way. But the British and Churchill, you talk about Churchill being a great war leader. Well, he was great in the sense that he rallied the British people and kept the morale up. And that he did, and was a great speech maker. But Churchill was not a great war leader and was terrified of confronting the Germans on the land. He wanted to limit it to the seas where the British had an advantage. So from a diplomatic standpoint, the fact that they delayed the opening of the second front was a disaster. U.S.-Soviet, British-Soviet relations plummeted in late 42 and early 43. Stalin believed that they were trying to bleed the Soviets dry, like happened to Russia in World War I, and that this was, he certainly didn't trust Churchill. As Roosevelt said to Churchill, was it at Tehran, I think, was it the meeting at Tehran, he said that when they met Stalin, he said, Stalin hates your guts and he hates the British. And so let me be the one to handle this. And that was when he built up his friendship with Stalin and started to call him Uncle Joe. And, Francis Perkins tells the story about how he did that.
That's really interesting.
but the Russians hated the Soviets, and I mean, I hated the British, and the British certainly Churchill hated and mistrusted the Soviet Union. Churchill was the one who said we should strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. Churchill and other Brits were the ones who led the invasion of the Soviet Union after the revolution occurred. The United States had 15,000 troops there also, but the British were pushing for the U.S. to help them overthrow the Soviet government. And Wilson, who was not also, his name was being taken down off the Wilson School and the Wilson Center, hopefully, and was a racist and imperialist. Wilson refused to go along with militarily overthrowing the Soviet government, but he did send the troops there and was assisting the White Army in opposition to the new Bolshevik government. That leads to the Civil War. And if there was any hope for a humane and progressive Soviet Union to emerge, it was destroyed in the Civil War that ensued, that was being fed by the West.
Interesting.
So hopes for the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Revolution, were really, the West succeeded in the same sense that the U.S. succeeded in Vietnam, lost the war militarily, but made sure that Vietnam would never serve as a model for anybody, revolutionary movement anywhere else, with the United States killing 3.8 million Vietnamese, or 3.8 million Vietnamese dying in the war, according to Robert McNamara, when he came to talk to my students. So Churchill is not one of my favorites. I'd be happy.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to take down and talk about racist. This guy was racist to the core, openly so, in the way the Brits could be. Henry Wallace deplored Churchill's racism openly, directly to his face. Roosevelt was a little bit more diplomatic, you might say. And Churchill deployed Roald Dahl, the writer, to actually spy on Henry Wallace. He was acting as a spy.
Yes. Yeah. Roald Dahl, the very famous children. Yeah. He was a spy. He was
serving as a spy for Churchill on Wallace, and stole an advanced copy of Wallace's pamphlet, in which Wallace is denouncing British and French imperialism, and had copied and sent back to Russia before Marsh, the publisher, realized it was missing. This is just another little tidbit of history.
But that being said, do you think that because you mentioned the Spanish Civil War, and do you think that the Spanish Civil War, that the reason why that isn't taught as much when we even talk about what led to the outbreak of World War II, because the West very much is complicit in the rise of, not just, a Christian fascist takeover of Spain, but but also, they also allowed, Hitler and Mussolini to show their military might.
Yeah. It was a testing ground in many ways for World War II. After that, then they take Sudetenland, and there's the Munich Declaration, and there were so many times to stop them. But the Spanish Civil War was one of those black and white situations where you had a very progressive, reform-minded government, popularly elected, anti-clerical in a lot of ways, but very progressive. And the only country that supported them was the Soviet Union, whereas Hitler and Mussolini poured lots and lots of aid and military support to the Franco-fascist forces. And among Franco's backers was our friend Winston Churchill. Churchill supported the fascist cause.
Canada as well. Even prosecuted soldiers who went to go fight in defense of the Spanish Republic or join whatever left-wing faction was fighting against the fascists.
A lot of Americans went over and fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. These were the heroes. You're talking about monuments. That'd be a great idea. We should have a monument to the Americans who went to fight against this fascist. But Roosevelt maintained this neutrality, partly because he didn't want to get into a fight with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was big backers of the fascists in Spain. So Roosevelt didn't want to challenge them, didn't fight as hard as he should have for American involvement and support of the Spanish Republic. So people went over there and fought on their own, and many people died because they were not well trained. And among those who went over to speak there was Paul Robeson, and the war stopped on both sides when Paul Robeson sang. So, but again, the left rallied around the cause. It became the cause célèbre for the left in 1936, 1937, but the American nation did not. The scientists were very mobilized in defense of the Spanish Republic, all the progressive scientists in the United States, African Americans, the Communist Party, a lot of progressive elements. But yeah,
but the Spanish Civil War gives too much. Well, obviously, it gives credit to those left-wing people power movements. Whereas, whereas if you airbrush the Spanish Civil War and you talk about World War II, all the credit goes to the Allies. It goes to the Churchills. It wrongly goes to Truman because he dropped the bomb. And then credit where credit is due is given to the Soviet Union, although that's also been going down the tubes these days because of the new anti-Russia Putin derangement syndrome that's going on, right?
Yes. But it's not just the United States. In France now, according to the latest polls I saw, 7% of the French people credit the Soviet Union with having won the war in Europe. 7%. Across Europe, it's
only 7% of French people give credit where credit is due to the Russians, whereas
the country that gives the most credit to the Russians is the Germans, and I forget the number. It's like 25 or 35%. But most of Europe, I think the average across Europe is either 13% or 17% of the Europeans give the primary credit to the Soviet Union. In the United States, it's a little bit higher in the younger generation, the 19 to 30-year-olds. The older generation in the United States is completely suckered in the same way and gives all the credit to the United States for having won the war. And Russians, I've taken students this year. We couldn't go because of coronavirus, but the 3 previous years, I brought students to Moscow for the Victory Day commemoration. Because I think it's very important that we recognize the role Russia played. And given the disappointment of the Russian Revolution, the thing that Russia has to be most proud of is its incredibly fierce, heroic resistance to the Nazis, which was widely recognized during the war. In fact, Orville Prescott, who was the principal daily book reviewer for the New York Times, wrote in one of his columns that if we don't live in slavery to the Nazis, we owe it all to the Soviet Union because they were the heroes who were defeating the Nazis. And Roosevelt understood this, and Wallace, and this was understood by the American people, which was why when the Cold War started, they had to reverse the attitude toward the Soviet Union, which is why Arthur Vandenberg told Truman that if you want to get the Truman Doctrine through Congress with the support of the American people, you're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people and convince them that the Russians are evil boogeymen. But it took a few years before they were able to do that because the attitude was so much more positive toward the Soviets during World War II because we saw them as heroes. But a big part of McCarthyism, when you talk about Hollywood, they went after the studios because they produced very positive pro-Russian films during World War II, which the government was happy for them to do. So you look at those films, which Americans never do anymore, but that was the first real target when the McCarthyites, before McCarthy, the first group they condemned were the atomic scientists. and said that they were the weakest link in American national security. But the first group they went after were not the scientists. The first group they went after was Hollywood. Now, why would McCarthyites go after Hollywood? And that's because they knew it was a hotbed of progressivism, that there had been a lot of communists and lots of progressives, and they mobilized in the anti-fascist fight. So the John Waynes and the Ronald Reagans were an outlier. But even Ronald Reagan at that point was a progressive Democrat. But that's who they go after first, because they know that's going to influence the American people.
Well, Walt Disney as well.
Yeah, Walt Disney was always a right wing.
And but some people, talking about Stalin's role in the Spanish Civil War, and this this leads directly into the question about the myths of Soviet expansionism after World War II. But before we get into that, some people would argue, those who've read, George Orwell's book, and those Trotskyist veterans of the Spanish Civil War would argue that actually it was Stalin that caused us to be defeated in the Spanish Civil War, because Stalin spent more time suppressing the social anarchists, the democratic socialists, and the Trotskyists, and only supporting the Stalinist factions. What do you say to that argument? Is there a little bit of truth in that, or?
Well, when you say only did that, then I think that's going much too far.
Okay.
But they did do that. And you mentioned Noam before, and Noam Chomsky has written about this from the perspective that you're suggesting, as part of
the sort of George Orwell point of view.
Yeah. Yes. He wrote about Homage to Catalonia, so there is some truth to that, and the same thing with the way the war was fought inside the Soviet Union. I mean, Stalin was brutal. Stalin was always brutal, but even before the war, the killing off of much of the Russian military leadership in the purges that went on, because they were supposedly Trotskyites, that weakened. He did a lot of things that undermined and weakened the Soviet cause, and because of his repression toward the kulaks and toward others across society, and the purges and the number of people who were killed, the Russian people, many of them were very hesitant to go to fight for Mother Russia at the time. They finally rallied
of World War II.
World War II, yeah, partly because so many people hated Stalinist repression. Then during the war, it's been estimated that Stalin's brutality in throwing people in there and his no retreat kind of policy and killing anybody who hesitated or retreated led to a lot more deaths than were necessary. So maybe a million lives could have been saved. So I'm happy to condemn everything that Stalin stood for, and I'm shocked when I go to Russia now. One of the deans at Moscow State University, one time when I was speaking there, said that he thought that 35% of the students at Moscow State University, Russia's top university, had a favorable view of Stalin, 35%. And we see in the polls, Stalin's approval rating has just been steadily climbing in Russia. And the Russians who I speak to, my friends there, say it's not because anybody approves of what Stalin did domestically. They say it's only because they see about the Russian victory in the war.
Okay.
But I'm much more deeply condemnatory of what Stalin stood for. Although Harriman's comments on Stalin are very, very interesting, because Averell Harriman, from the Brown Brothers banking family and the railroad interests, from this top elite family, and was U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union during the war, he said that there was no other leader in the world who could have achieved what Stalin achieved. And he has said that when he compares Stalin to Roosevelt and Churchill, in many ways, he has more respect for Stalin. He said, despite his barbaric cruelty, he said on a personal level, Stalin could be warm and gracious and solicitous, and that he had the best mind and was the best educated and informed and the best war leader of the three. With coming from Harriman, this to me was astounding. So, there was another side to Stalin, but Stalin in many ways not only destroyed the Russian Revolution, but made socialism impossible for the rest of the world. I think that the Russian Revolution was an albatross around the necks of the left throughout the 20th century. And now, one of the good things about the young people in America not knowing any history is they don't know how bad the Soviet Union was in certain respects. And so the surveys that show that among the 18 to 30-year-olds in the United States, that by a 2-to-1 margin, they prefer socialism to capitalism, is partly a positive consequence of that. They don't associate it with the excesses of the Soviet Union. They see a more positive vision of socialism. They think of a democratic socialism, which is the direction that we need to go. So I'm not sure what the question was, but certainly Stalin's role in the Spanish Civil War was mixed. But from the recent studies I've seen, the recent evidence that his repressive side has been exaggerated, and that I was not nearly as prominent a feature of why
the Spanish Republic and okay.
But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And we see, and I started to say that we see the same thing inside the Soviet Union itself, with his killing off the officer corps, or much of the officer corps, which left them again unprepared. And during the period of so I can understand, I can't approve of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but I can understand why Stalin would do that. But you have to use that time to build up, to get ready for fighting against Germany, which was inevitable, which Hitler lays out in Mein Kampf, that the real goal is going to be to take Ukraine, to take much
to make the living space.
Right. And we knew that was the goal. But when the Western intelligence was warning Stalin that Hitler was preparing the invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin wouldn't believe it. And so when the invasion occurs, Russia was totally unprepared. And the concern in the West was that the Soviets were going to surrender during that initial blitzkrieg. But Stalin assured them, first Stalin collapses and disappears for the first few days. He's so demoralized by what happens. But then the Soviets resist, and they fight the Germans off during the Battle of Moscow, and they're not able to take Moscow. But Stalin assured the West that if they give them the materiel, that support, then they were going to resist. They were going to stay in the war. They're going to fight and persevere. But the British doubted that they could, and many Americans doubted that they'd be able to.
Well, since we can actually have an honest conversation and about Stalin and Russia, during the Cold War and after, with the rise of Putin, then okay. So
let me interrupt one more time.
Sure.
Because I started to talk about this heroic tradition, and that the thing that the Russians have today to be most proud of is that they led the fight. And so when the West
twice Spanish Civil War and World War II,
when the West denies that, as we do now, and doesn't recognize that really hurts inside inside Russia. But the flip side of that is that when Putin cozies up to these right-wing forces, these neo-fascist forces in Eastern Europe or in Germany or in France, he is besmirching the reputation of Russia in World War II and Russia's heroic resistance against fascism, that Putin should understand better than anybody that there is no justification for giving any kind of support or legitimacy to the neo-fascist forces around the world today, and that undermines the achievements of the Soviet Union in World War II that he seems to be so proud of. And so it's a dual-edged sword in that way. If you're going to claim that as your legacy, then you have to live up to it today. And Putin has not
and that
done
yeah
that.
and that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about, which unfortunately you didn't get the chance to talk about it with moderate rebels with Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton. So yeah, let's continuing from that, let's talk about that, because following the end of World War II, now unfortunately came the Cold War, and with the Cold and actually, well, hold up, let me and with the Cold War, there became the demonization of of Russia and so forth, and then of course came the weaponization of half-truths, because yes, the Soviet Union was a repressive society, and the way they repressed their satellite states, Ukraine, Georgia, and Central Asia, was very repressive. And I fear, but talk about, the Soviet Union, they justified that the reason why they had to expand the USSR into Eastern Europe, like Romania and all those places, was because of what happened to them, in World War II. But do you think that we'll never find a way forward in terms of having a good détente with Russia, without recognizing that it was not nice to live under the Soviet Union, if you were Romanian, if you were Ukrainian, and so forth. And the more that that the Western left and the anti-imperialists kind of sort of poo-poo that means that gives legitimacy to some of the worst forces in Eastern Europe who do want to join NATO, and of course the situation in Ukraine where the West has supported rival oligarchs and rival neo-Nazis who weaponize grievances, anti-Russian grievances. And now we're back, of course, into this horrible, vicious cycle where it seems like we never are going to get out of Cold War and ever, find better relations with, Russia, even though Russia now is ruled by, oligarchs and capitalists.
Well, the history, it is 10 hours worth of things to discuss in that question. but what people have to understand about the history is that, so Russia's our gallant ally during the war. The last cable that Roosevelt sent to Churchill, he said that these issues between us and the Soviets come up every day, and they seem to work out and get resolved. We shouldn't blow them out of proportion and make a big deal about it. So his last cable to Churchill was about the need for maintaining post-war friendship, and Roosevelt was convinced that he and Stalin would be able to do so. Now, one of the tragedies in history, or crimes in history, is the fact that Henry Wallace was ousted from the Democratic Party ticket in 1944 and replaced by Harry Truman. Even though the American people loved Henry Wallace, even though Time and Newsweek and others said that Wallace was Roosevelt's natural successor, even though Wallace had been vice president for 4 years and was a visionary, the greatest visionary in American 20th century politics, and a friend, wanted to maintain friendly relations with the Soviets. And even though the American people, on the eve of the Democratic Convention, Gallup released a poll on July 20th, 1944, the day the convention began, that showed that 65% of the American people wanted Wallace back on the ticket as vice president, and 2% wanted Harry Truman as vice president. Truman got the nomination. So the weakness of American democracy isn't only so evident today. This goes way back.
Yeah.
But so Truman gets the nomination. Wallace stays on as Secretary of Commerce, and Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945. So Truman had been vice president for 82 days, and he knew nothing about. Well, Roosevelt had met with him twice during that time, and they didn't speak about anything about policy, about what happened at Yalta, about the other agreements. So he knew nothing. One of the astounding facts in American history is that Truman had been vice president for 82 days. Nobody even bothered to tell him that we were building an atomic bomb. Can you imagine? He doesn't know about the atomic bomb till he gets sworn in as president that night on April 12th.
And is that, but was that because people were just so bitter about the fact that Wallace was cheated that they just shunned him? Or
no, it wasn't even that. Nobody respected him. I mean, Truman was this hack. But he was part of the Pendergast machine from Kansas City before Pendergast gets his ass thrown in jail because of his corruption. And when Pendergast told the newspapers after when they asked him, why did you choose Harry Truman to run for the Senate? And Pendergast said, I wanted to show the world that a well-run political machine could take an office boy and run him for the Senate. I mean, that was Pendergast's comment. Truman was a nobody. He built roads. We won't go too much into Truman now, unless you want me to, but because I could go off on this. So Truman takes office first day in office is April 13th. Within 10 days, when Molotov comes to visit on April 23rd, Truman has reversed U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union. And in that meeting with Molotov, he berates him, and he's accused him of having broken all the Yalta agreements. Molotov was shocked, and he said, this is not accurate, and he defended them. And then Molotov says, I've never been talked to that way in my life. And Truman says, carry out your agreements. You won't need to be talked to like that. And he comes out of the meeting and he tells the other cabinet members, he says, I gave it to him 1-2 to the jaw. And he's bragging about how tough he was. And he says, we might not get 100% of what we want from the Soviets. We should get 85%. But it was Harriman who rushed over here and was instrumental in convincing Truman. He said that the Soviets are carrying out a barbaric invasion of Europe. And part of it, as you were saying, is true that the Soviets were repressive. In Germany, there was mass rape of the German women committed by the Soviet soldiers. But these soldiers had liberated the concentration camps. They had suffered 27 million dead in Russia. Their hatred of the Germans knew no bounds, and they treated them terribly during the post-war period, till Stalin gave the word, cut out the raping. Subsequently, there is severe repression going on throughout the Soviet zone, much worse than in the Western zone in terms of the actual day-to-day repression. And you look at the Stasi, the secret police that are later going to run Germany. The estimate is that there was one Stasi informant for every 6 people in East Germany. Frightened, terrifying society. Much in the same way as I condemn the U.S. Cold War against China that's starting again, but I condemn the Chinese society.
Yeah.
Society has got 300 million surveillance cameras. I mean, who wants to live in a world that you're totally under surveillance? I mean, what kind of freedom and dignity and democracy are you going to have? There's no thought to the democracy there. And to me, that's dystopian. That's frightening. So where I condemn the American empire, and I'm glad to see the end of the Pax Americana, I'm not welcoming the Chinese empire either. Well, that's another topic. But in terms of repression in Eastern Europe, yes. But the way to end the repression in Eastern Europe is to end the Cold War. And the way you end the Cold War is not by intensifying it and playing on Stalin's paranoia. and building up the nuclear armaments and threatening the Soviet Union with annihilation. I mean, the Americans held all the cards after World War II. As John Kennedy says in the American University commencement address in '63, what the Soviets suffered in World War II is the equivalent of the entire United States east of Chicago being wiped out. So the Soviets were desperate for economic aid. They wanted to maintain friendly relations in the post-war period. That was essential for their economic recovery. And what Roosevelt had been doing was talking about a $20 million reparation figure, and that half of it was going to go to the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted that desperately. But instead, what happens with Germany is we divide it up in a different way. We'll let the Soviets loot their zone, but all the reparations that we were promising, dangling in front of them, do not go to them, and we begin to build up this hostile relationship. And Wallace, from inside the cabinet, fought against it. He fought against the nuclear arms race. He wanted to get rid of America's nuclear weapons. He fought against the Cold War policies consistently over that period and talked about the need to work in friendship with the Soviet Union. Had that happened, then the repression in Eastern Europe would have been much milder, because if you look at the first year and a half, they were not cracking down. They not at least to that extent. They allowed free elections. Elections were much freer in Eastern Europe than they were ever in the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. So it was not really till after the Truman Doctrine that they begin to really crack down, and they throw the progressives out in Czechoslovakia and other countries and start having this kind of knee-jerk, anti-democratic, repressive policies. So there was that window between 45 and 47 when we could have stopped the Cold War and limited the repression in Eastern Europe. When Stalin dies in 1953, then the Soviet leaders reach out to the United States, offer an olive branch to the United States, basically say it's time to end the Cold War and begin working together again. The U.S. rejects that. Eisenhower makes his great speech about the, humanity hanging from a cross of iron or steel, and and that the cost of American militarism, and it gets republished all over the Soviet Union. But then the next 2 days later, Dulles makes a speech condemning the Soviets and for repressive and basically accusing them of wanting to take over the world. This image of the Soviets as trying to conquer the world was never true for a minute. That's not what Eastern Europe was about. As you started to say, what Eastern Europe was about to the Soviets was they wanted a buffer zone between themselves and Germany. They'd been invaded twice through Eastern Europe by Germany within 25 years. And now they wanted a buffer zone. They thought that was the only way to safeguard them from a reemergent Germany that was going to invade them again. And that was the key to Russian foreign policy. And the West didn't understand that. The British wanted to rebuild the British Empire after the war, and the Americans.
So it's wrong. So do you think while one can condemn the Soviet Union for taking over, Hungary and Poland, that it's wrong to even sort of say, well, that's because of Soviet imperialism. That no, it wasn't because of Soviet imperialism, although you can argue it was wrong for them to take over, but it more had to do again with the actions of the West. The West, dropping the atomic bomb and starting, an arms race, and and all the things that that you were saying about Truman.
I think that the United States held most of the cards after the war. The American economy was booming. American society was vibrant. There was positive sentiment toward the Soviet Union for having played such an instrumental role in winning the war. Had we had a different leader, had Henry Wallace become president, or had Franklin Roosevelt lived longer, and then there would have been no atomic bombing in 1945, and there would have likely been no Cold War, because they were visionaries. and they could understand how the world looked to the Soviets, and they could sympathize with the plight that the Soviet Union was in, and they would have provided economic aid. They would have reached out in friendship, and Stalin was desperate for that, and saw the alliance. When Harriman went to tell Stalin that Roosevelt had died, Stalin was devastated. He was beside himself with grief. He believed that the US and the Soviets were going to maintain friendship afterwards. He did not have a vision for world conquest. Part of his difference between him and Trotsky was Trotsky wanted a permanent revolution, a global revolution. And Stalin talked about socialism in one country. And that was his vision. He was a Russian nationalist, and he wanted to build up the Soviet Union. And what Eastern Europe represented was not some great bounty for Soviet Union. What Eastern Europe represented was kind of a drag on the economy, and they invested enormous amounts in maintaining that. They would have been much better off without Eastern Europe. What they wanted were friendly governments. They did not demand lockstep repressive governments until 47, and that's when things changed. So, I mean, and in a similar way, we could talk about when things change between the United States and Russia now. And Ben Rhodes, in his memoir, talks about what happened at Maidan. And he said the Maidan uprising shifted a gear. And he said it was after that we see the hostile actions from Russia. It was after that we see the Russian bots and Russian interference and Russia viewing the West as its enemy. And that, because what that goes back to is Brzezinski's 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, where he lays out and says explicitly that Russia can never become an empire again that can threaten the United States unless it has Ukraine. If we can wrest Ukraine away from Russia, then they're never going to pose the threat of becoming a major empire again. And the neocons double down on that. You see what Hadley and Scooter Libby and Wolfowitz were writing, saying the same thing about the importance of Ukraine. And so when the deals go through, after Yanukovych rejects the deal with Europe, with the EU, and signs the deal with Russia, it's at that point when the Russians actually offered a much better deal. And what Russia was talking about, what Putin was talking about, was Ukraine having relations with both. But the deal that was demanded by
so contrary to the myth that it's the Russians who finds it unacceptable that Ukraine can join the European Union and continue doing, trade with Russia. Actually, no, it's actually not true to say that Putin only wants Ukraine to do trading with him. And actually, it was the European Union itself and the West that actually only wanted Ukraine to be another, European Union vassal states.
You'd have to just look at the language in that original agreement that they signed, that they then Yanukovych repudiated. Now, I'm not saying Yanukovych was a good leader. I'm not saying he wasn't corrupt up to his eyeballs.
And he certainly was no flaming left-winger.
No. There were no good guys there.
Exactly.
Zelensky, maybe he's trying, but he's tied to the oligarchs too. But the agreement, and this was the vision, because you have to go back a little further, when Gorbachev allowed the unification of Germany in 1990, he was promised by Baker and by the Germans, by the American, by Bush, that NATO would not expand 1 thumb's width or 1 inch to the east. But what we know is they promised him that. He never got it in writing, which was naive of Gorbachev. There's a lot of things I love about Gorbachev, but he never got it in writing. And he's very unpopular in Russia now, whereas Stalin is probably more popular than Gorbachev in Russia today, but not for me. So Gorby didn't get it in writing, but within months, NATO was already planning for the expansion into Eastern Europe. So even though they promised it didn't take even months before they started breaking the promise and planning on this. They don't begin the expansion until 1999, when it finally starts. And now NATO has expanded 13 countries to the east. But in 2008, George Bush said that we want to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. And when he did that, he'd been warned not to do that. The U.S. ambassador
George W. Bush.
George W. Bush. The U.S. ambassador Burns wrote a secret memo to back to here that said it was titled "Niet means Niet." He said, "This is Russia's red line. Don't even think about crossing it." And yet Bush did say we want NATO to expand, and it's really at that point that we see the beginnings of the Russian resistance, because Putin's relationship with Russia at that point, with Putin's relationship with NATO, was actually pretty positive up to that point. And then we start talking about NATO expansion, Ukraine and Georgia, and Putin realizes at that point that these are not his allies, and that their basic interests are directly contradictory toward Russian basic interests. And so from there to the deal with Ukraine, to the Maidan uprising, to the neocons' involvement in what was happening there, to Joe Biden's involvement in what was happening there, I mean, it's pretty much a straight line to the terrible relation we have now. So one of the pieces that Oliver and I wrote was called "Through Russian Eyes," and we talked about how the Russians view the history of the last 100 years compared to how Americans view the history of the last 100 years. But it's important that Americans understand that, because Americans do not have the ability to understand how the world looks through Russian eyes. And that's why I loved Henry Wallace. That's why I loved John Kennedy in the last year of his life. That's why Thomas Franklin Roosevelt, because they can see the world through the eyes of our adversaries. But clearly, Donald Trump can't even see the world through anybody's eyes other than, he's a narcissistic fool, a simpleton. But that's what leaders have to be able to do. So when people ask me, what I think about what's going on with China, I mean, I look at how the Chinese see the world, what the century of humiliation means to them, what their relationship with their other Asian neighbors means to them. I don't like what they're doing in the South China Sea. I don't like what they're doing with the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. I think that their behavior is self-defeating from the standpoint of their own self-interest. I think
even some of the threats that the Chinese make, that they want to take over Taiwan, also is counterproductive.
What they're doing in Hong Kong, to me, it's unnecessary. I mean, they're paranoid, and so many of this surplus repression. I mean, Marcuse developed that concept in the 1960s, this idea of surplus repression, and in some ways we should apply it. I mean, I can understand a certain degree of control from that government, but they are so overly paranoid and fearful of popular uprisings. Even the way they teach about Tiananmen Square now, or don't teach about it, what's going on now in Hong Kong. I mean, I think that they're their own worst enemy, and this kind of surplus repression is going to lead to more questioning, resistance, rebellion, and that they're.
But in defense of the Chinese, just like what happened with Ukraine, in which, hey, if Ukraine wants to join the European Union, okay, they can, but they're not going to like the further austerity package the European Union is going to force on them. Just as all of Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War got these very reactionary, backwards austerity things, which ironically led to the rise of all of these rival oligarchs fighting each other, all these rival far right people fighting each other, and of course, we all know for a fact that that what happened in Russia with that reactionary free market reform led to the rise of Yeltsin, which ironically now led to the rise of Putin. And and of course the forces that are happening in Hong Kong, the protests there, many of those have been supported by the National Endowment of Democracy, which I guess is why the Chinese probably are overly paranoid and passing repressive measures, as you've described. What's your reflection on that?
Yeah, my reflection is that China was moving in a more positive direction before Xi Jinping.
Okay, interesting.
That the government under Xi Jinping has taken China in the wrong direction. I mean, China is about 40% state-controlled, the economy, and 60% capitalist. But the society is still very tightly controlled. It's a society that doesn't open up to the internet. Now, we might condemn the internet in a lot of ways, but it doesn't open up to the outside world, and it doesn't trust its own people. I don't like a government that doesn't trust its own people. So I'm not saying that the US model is the model that everybody should follow, because the US doesn't live up to its own standards and ideals either. But the US has freedom of the press. Freedom of the press means I turn on MSNBC or CNN, and I would look at the four talking heads, experts, who talk about the Russian involvement in the American elections in 2016, and all condemning it as an act of war. Not a single time do you hear anybody in mainstream American television talk about American interference everywhere around the world since World War II, in election after election, or in overthrowing governments, and
including
in Ukraine. Yeah, and talk about that as an act of war. But when somebody does that to us, or allegedly does that to us, it's an act of war. And we've got to, it's the worst thing that's ever happened. There's just none of that perspective and none of that context. So we have freedom of the press, but you're not going to hear somebody with my views on American mainstream television, or Noam Chomsky, or Howard Zinn, or David Swanson. We don't get on mainstream. So there is freedom of the press, but it is controlled in such a narrow band of acceptable opinion that it's almost meaningless. But Oliver and I can go around the country and say what we want, and we're not afraid we're going to get, thrown in jail for what we're doing. You don't have that same freedom in China. You don't have that same freedom even in Russia. I know that. I mean, I do so much Russian media, and they allow me to criticize Putin as much as I want, and I do, and criticize Russia's. And I was just on yesterday with the Russia One, the main TV channel, and they were asking me about the recent election in Russia and the constitutional reform and Putin becoming president for life. And I condemn that harshly. And I condemn the fact that in their constitution now, they say that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. I condemn the fact that they're, if anything, intensifying the role of religion in Russian life, putting Russian law over international law, all these different things. And that gets on there. So I get more access to be critical of Russia in Russian media than I do to be critical of the United States in American mainstream media. So yes, we have ideals that are good that we have to fight for. We have to fight for freedom of the press and freedom of speech and the right to protest. And when Trump does what he does, when these police forces do, and the National Guard does what they do in repressing people's right to protest, that has to be resisted and condemned for what it is, both unconstitutional and against what the United States is supposed to stand for. We have to hold the mirror up to the United States to be its best self and to play a positive role in the world. I don't want to see the United States retrench. I don't want to see the United States become isolationist. I don't want to see the United States pull out of the rest of the world. I just want to see the United States play a positive role and not to expand American empire, not to rebuild or to fortify our empire of bases. We live in a world in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 3.8 billion people. That's obscene. That's obscene. And this is the world that the United States created out of World War II.
And ironically, that's what the United States did to Russia. So instead of having a kind of social democratic thing, which I guess which some argue Gorbachev wanted to do, but then it all just went, belly up. Instead, Russia got Yeltsin, a market fundamentalist, and then later Putin, who the West did approve until things kind of went,
Yeah. And
so
it was terrible. And standard of living, well, life expectancy. So the United States comes in as Yeltsin's advisors, and put Russia through the shock doctrine, basically,
exactly.
and impose capitalism overnight. And the effects were terrible. Life expectancy plummets from 60s for men from 66 down to 57. The economy is destroyed, shrinks to the size of Holland's economy. And Soviet Union had been it was not doing well in the 1980s and started to decline in the 70s, but was obviously one of the world's two superpowers. And now they're on their knees. And I got an email from Jeffrey Sachs, because Sachs and his crew from Harvard and Columbia were instrumental in doing this. And he says to me, "Peter, you guys really raked me over the coals in Untold History." And we did. And we did. And he says that he was not as guilty as we said. He said that in Russia, they ignored all of his advice. He said he took credit for Poland and what happened there, but not what happened in Russia. But it was devastating for the Russian people, and the economy plummets. And then the United States and Putin Yeltsin's doing so badly in 1996 that the Americans have to come in and rescue him. His approval rating was 7%. He was doing at 7% in the polling for the presidential election in 1996, and the U.S. sends its supporters and advisors, and it was openly reported in the American press the role that we played in intervening in the Russian election that year, and it looked like the communist was going to win, and Yeltsin ends up pulling it out at the end. There's even a Hollywood film that talks about this called Spinning Boris, which is open about the role the American advisors played. So it's not very, very subtle or covert or hidden. We were proud of it, as we were proud of what we did in overthrowing. Well, we can go into the whole history.
And also the austerity was so atrocious that Parliament tried to stop more of those things, and Yeltsin sent in the Russian army and so forth, and then of course, because of Yeltsin's alcoholism, he replaces himself with Putin, who is an oligarch, but it's just he's not a puppet of the U.S. Just like if people want to argue that China is no longer a Maoist economy, and yes, they do accept cheap labor from the U.S. and the working conditions are poor, but the Chinese is not the puppet of the U.S. or any Western power compared to say in Indonesia, Vietnam, or the Philippines. And I think that basically is why the rival oligarchs in the U.S. from Clinton all the way to Bush and Obama have this Putin derangement syndrome, right?
Well, I might disagree with you about Vietnam, and I don't see Vietnam as quite being a puppet of the United States yet. But I see Vietnam as trying to play off the United States against China.
Okay.
So, but certain military arrangements that they're making with the U.S., I think, are hard to stomach, given the history of what we did. I was supposed to go there in October with a delegation of historians. We were invited by a delegation of Vietnamese historians for a conference over there to talk about the legacy of the Vietnam War, or as I refer to it.
I'll just interrupt quickly to say that Professor Michel Chossudovsky of Montreal, who runs the censor, who runs globalresearch.ca, which is a very good website, especially on like Canadian news. He, in an interview on the Global Research News Hour, said that Vietnam won won the battle, meaning the Vietnam War, but that they lost the war overall because of the embargo, the sanctions, and then eventually they just said, okay, we embrace some form of capitalism in which Australian, American, and British businesses can come in, use them for cheap labor and so forth. So I just wanted to mention that when it came to Vietnam.
Vietnam is another thing we could go on for hours. But unfortunately, I probably have to leave you because
Yeah.
I've got another interview I'm supposed to do. We've been talking for about 2 hours. So we can continue this another time.
All right. Actually, all right. So on that note, we'll say that this conversation is to be continued. But although you more or less addressed a lot of the questions that I did want to ask you, but if there's any follow up, yeah, well we will definitely do this. We'll definitely do it another time.
Did you have any last question that you were meaning to ask? That we haven't?
No. I think we more or less covered it, and yeah, I think we more or less covered it. But and you even addressed the criticism of Putin, because I think it's also important that that anti-imperialists and the Western left, it's noble that they don't want the pivot of Asia to continue on, and it's noble of them to even speak out against what happened in Ukraine, and to speak out against the nonsense of all the whole anti-Russia Putin derangement syndrome, which is being weaponized to undermine Trump for one of the only good things he's on, but that we also shouldn't depict the Chinese and and the Russians as as the kind of society we should emulate, that we do have that we should criticize them when need be, but of course, not let that be weaponized for half-truths, the most dangerous form of propaganda.
We should applaud them when they do good things.
Yeah,
I like that Putin has called for a summit meeting of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. One of the things I've been outspoken about is the fact that there's no leadership as a global community. That if anything, this pandemic has made it more and more apparent to everybody how interconnected we are. And yet you've got Trump talking about making America great again, Putin talking about making Russia great again, Xi talking about making China great again, Modi talking about making India great again. You go down the line, I mean, I guess Boris Johnson, that's too much of a joke to talk about making Britain great again. But everybody...
It'll happen once he delivers Brexit, is what he would say.
But everybody's this hyper-nationalism at a time when we're desperate for global solutions to the climate change, to the nuclear arms race, to pandemics, to the gap between rich and poor, to the destruction of the rainforest. We're just destroying our planet, and so we need to. Not that any of them, I think, have the answers that I'd like to see, but at least we've got to begin talking and working together, rather than this dangerous, insane, destructive policies of militarism and antagonism that we see right now. So on that note,
on that note, this conversation is to be continued, but Mr. Kuznick, thank you so much for taking the time out on this 4th of July to come speak to us on 1+1, and this of course will be the first of many. This of course will be the first of many conversations. And oh yes, and also happy birthday to happy birthday to your wife, and I hope that it will all be very good celebrations.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Take care. Bye bye.